Where are you watching from today, city and country? Tell us in the comments. And please subscribe, like, share this video so we can get this story across to a wider audience and rewrite the false history many people were told. The night was thick with sea mist, and the shoreline of the Virginia colony looked less like a place of promise and more like the edge of a warning. In the summer of 1619, when a battered ship carrying captive Africans drifted toward Point Comfort, few of the people waiting on land understood that they were standing at the mouth of a darkness that would swallow generations. The colony itself was already desperate, half-starving, disease-ridden, and built on fear. Men who had crossed the Atlantic chasing gold and glory had instead found hunger, muddy fields, and graves. Tobacco had begun to save them, but tobacco demanded land, and land demanded labor, and labor demanded bodies, many bodies, more bodies than willing hands could provide. At first, the English had tried many things. They pushed poor Europeans into hard contracts. They used indentured servants, men and women, who agreed to work for years in exchange for passage across the ocean. Some survived long enough to claim freedom. Many did not. The fields consumed them. The heat punished them. The insects tore at them. The soil stained their hands, and the colonies swallowed their names. Yet even this system did not satisfy the hunger of the planters, because free people, even poor people, could one day leave. They could demand land, wages, rights, and dignity. But a person turned into property could be forced to remain forever. That idea did not appear all at once like lightning. It crawled into America like a serpent, quiet, cold, and patient. Long before the English built permanent colonies, European empires had already been experimenting with human bondage in the Atlantic world. The Portuguese and Spanish had opened violent trade routes that tore people from West and Central Africa. Armed merchants, middlemen, and raiders fed a machine of human capture. Men, women, and children were chained, marched, branded, and sold. Their names were cut from them like cloth. Their histories were treated as if they were worthless. Yet they were not faceless, and they were not born for slavery. They came from nations with language, law, memory, poetry, trade, agriculture, music, and power. Some were Mandinka, some were Akan, some were Wolof, some were Igbo. Some were from places where gold was weighed carefully, and stories were carried by griots like sacred fire. Some had never seen the ocean before the day it became a wall between them and everyone they loved. One of them, in the story we tell tonight, was a young Mandinka man named Fode, taken after a violent raid near a trading path his family had used for generations. He had known drums, market voices, and the smell of millet roasting at sunset. He had known his mother's warnings about strangers who smiled too easily, and his father's lessons about honor, patience, and the danger of men who sold their own souls before selling others. But warnings are useless when greed is armed. Fode's capture did not happen in some empty wilderness. It happened in a world already poisoned by trade, war, and ambition. He was seized with others, tied by the neck, and driven inland with feet bleeding to the dust. Beside him walked a young Akan woman named Abena, whose eyes had stopped showing fear because fear had already burned itself out. She had seen her village attacked before dawn. She had heard the screams. She had smelled smoke and blood together. She had not cried since. People who lose everything too fast often become frighteningly quiet. That quiet would follow her all the way across the ocean. The coast was worse than the march. There, in the foul air of holding forts, they learned what men with ledgers and chains truly thought of them. They were inspected like animals, touched without consent, spoken over, priced, and separated. Language collapsed into noise. Families vanished in moments. Names were ignored, the doors shut. The ocean waited. The crossing that followed would become known as the Middle Passage, but that phrase is too clean for what it was. It was a floating grave. Bodies packed into darkness, wrists swollen with iron, sickness spreading in waves, screams swallowed by planks, children crying until they had no strength left to cry. Some died from disease, some from despair, some from beatings, some from the simple fact that the human body has a limit to how much cruelty it can endure. Fode counted time by the groans of the ship. Abena counted by the dead. Another captive, an older Akan man named Corbina, whispered fragments of prayers at night so quietly that only those pressed close could hear him. A woman called Essie sang under her breath, not because she believed rescue was coming, but because the song was the last piece of home no one had yet managed to steal. On some nights, the ship rose and crashed so violently that people thought the sea itself might open and swallow everyone, captives and captors alike. Some prayed for that ending. Some tried to leap into the water when they were brought above deck. The crew answered with whips, iron collars, and terror. By the time the ship neared English America, the survivors were not arriving in a new world. They were being delivered into a system that had already begun to imagine them as permanent labor. Yet the truth is more twisted than many people realize. In those early years, the lines were not fully hardened. Some Africans in colonial Virginia were initially treated in ways that resembled indentured servitude, rather than the complete hereditary chattel slavery that would later define America. That uncertainty matters because it reveals something terrifying. Slavery in America was not simply inherited in finished form. It was built piece by piece, law by law, fear by fear, profit by profit. It was chosen. When Fode and Abena were traded into the colony, the men who acquired them were not merely solving a labor problem. They were helping invent a social order. They looked at Africans and saw an opportunity to create a workforce that could be controlled more completely than poor Europeans. They saw darker skin and turned it into a tool of separation. They saw a chance to divide the powerless before the powerless could unite. That fear was not imaginary. In the rough early colonies, poor whites and black laborers often worked side by side, suffered side by side, and in some cases resisted side by side. The elites noticed. They noticed every glance, every friendship, every shared resentment. The wealthy planter class understood something cold and dangerous. If the poor ever saw each other as equals, the entire colonial order could crack. So race was sharpened into a weapon. Laws slowly changed, customs hardened, punishments grew unequal. The same colony that had once been chaotic and uncertain began constructing categories that would trap millions. Fode learned this not from a book or a judge, but from the field. At first, he worked beside Europeans whose lives were also brutal, but not equally doomed. They spoke of contracts ending, of land they might claim, of futures they imagined beyond the tobacco rows. Fode listened in silence. He understood enough to know that even the most broken among them still possessed something he was being denied, the possibility of belonging to himself. One evening, after a storm had ruined part of the crop and tempers were running hot, a servant from England struck an overseer and tried to flee. The man was hunted, beaten, and dragged back. But even then, people whispered that after years of labor, he might still one day be free. That night, Fode looked at his own scarred wrists and understood a terrible truth before anyone said it aloud. The rules were shifting around him, and they were shifting against him. Abena learned it another way. She was sent into the house at times, then back to the labor of the yard, then back again, as if her body belonged to every task and every whim. The mistress watched her with suspicion. The master watched her with ownership. Neither gaze was safe. She learned to read footsteps, voices, doors, and moods. Survival became a science. She began storing tiny fragments of memory, songs, words, names, because she sensed something monstrous was happening, something larger than pain. People were being unmade on purpose, not just worked, not just beaten, but transformed into a category meant to outlive them. In the years that followed, the colony would expand, tobacco would enrich landowners, and the demand for labor would become insatiable. Ships would keep coming, more captives, more laws, more excuses. But in those first shadowed years before the full machine had locked into place, there was still an eerie uncertainty. And that uncertainty made the horror even more suspenseful, because no one trapped inside it could yet see how vast it would become. They only knew that something was changing, and every change seemed to remove one more path to freedom. On a night of heavy rain, when thunder rolled over the fields and cabins leaked onto sleeping bodies, Abena whispered to Fode that systems built on greed always need a lie to survive. Fode asked him what Upply this one would choose. The old man stared into the dark and answered in a voice so low it was almost swallowed by the storm, that we were born for this. And with that single sentence, the true beginning of slavery in America revealed itself not just in chains and ships, but in the birth of a lie so powerful that a nation would build itself on it, defend it with law, preach it from pulpits, profit from it in silence, and teach it until even some of the wounded began to fear it might be true. But the lie was only beginning, and the people who would carry its weight had not yet seen the worst of what America was preparing to become. By the time the heat returned to Virginia and the tobacco leaves began to thicken again under the long sun, the colony had become a place where fear no longer hid in corners. It walked openly among men sat at their tables, rode beside them on dusty roads, and slept beside them at night. On the surface, everything still looked as if the powerful were in control. The fields stretched farther than before. The storehouses were fuller. The houses of the rich rose taller against the sky. Men in fine coats still spoke as if they had built a stable world with their own hands. But underneath that polished image, the colony was trembling. Too many people had been squeezed too hard for too long. Too many laborers were exhausted. Too many poor white settlers felt cheated. Too many servants had completed their years of bondage only to discover that freedom in Virginia often meant hunger, with no chains instead of hunger with chains. And all the while, the enslaved watched carefully, because they had learned something that the wealthy feared more than open rebellion. When suffering begins to look familiar across different faces, dangerous thoughts begin to grow. Fode had begun to notice it in the way people moved. The air itself felt tense. Even ordinary sounds carried new meaning. A horse galloping too fast down the road could mean trouble. A late-night meeting in the main house could mean rumors had arrived. An overseer shouting louder than usual could mean he himself was afraid. Fear was no longer a private thing in Virginia. It had become part of the colony's breathing. One evening, after the work bell had fallen silent and the fields were emptying into darkness, Fode found himself beside a poor white laborer named Elias, a man whose back had already begun to bend under years of disappointment. Elias had come to the colony with dreams of land and self-respect, but Virginia had eaten those dreams one season at a time. That night he sat on an overturned barrel, staring into the dirt, with a bitterness so deep it looked older than he was. He muttered that the masters fed all of them just enough to keep them alive and just little enough to keep them desperate. Fode listened in silence. Then, after a long pause, he asked quietly, "When your hunger ends, will theirs end too?" Elias looked at him without answering, because the question reached deeper than complaint. It exposed the structure beneath the suffering. It suggested that the men at the top were not failing by accident. They were succeeding exactly as they intended. That kind of understanding was dangerous. The colony could survive anger. It could survive cursing. It could survive scattered resentment. But what it could not survive easily was clarity, especially clarity shared across the lines it was trying so hard to maintain. The wealthy men of Virginia understood that instinctively, even if they would never admit it in such plain words. That was why they worked so hard to keep everyone beneath them suspicious of one another. They needed the poor white to fear the enslaved more than he feared the planter. They needed the servant to envy the black laborer, rather than question the man profiting from both. They needed pain to remain divided. Because if pain ever recognized itself across those boundaries, the whole colony could become unstable. Abena could hear that instability growing inside the main house long before it became visible in the fields. The master and his visitors had become restless men. The conversations over supper had changed. They no longer spoke only of harvests, trade, and land. They now spoke in lower voices about unrest, about the governor, about attacks, about men gathering in anger, about complaints spreading too far. What disturbed Abena most was not what they said, but how they said it. These were men used to command, men used to being obeyed, men who believed the colony existed for their comfort. Yet now their confidence had a crack in it. She heard anxiety beneath the arrogance. She heard panic trying to disguise itself as strategy. And she understood something that made her blood run cold. The men who ruled Virginia were beginning to realize that too many people beneath them were no longer content to remain silent. Soon one name began to move through the colony like a spark through dry brush. Nathaniel Bacon. At first it was only a rumor carried from road to road and plantation to plantation. A frustrated man, a reckless man, a bold man, a dangerous man. To some poor settlers, Bacon became a symbol of anger against a government they believed had abandoned them. To the elite, he represented something far more terrifying than one angry planter. He represented the possibility that resentment in Virginia was beginning to organize itself. Bacon's rebellion would later be dressed up in different stories depending on who was telling it. But in the moment, it felt like what it truly was, a sign that the colony's foundations were not secure. The rebellion was not pure. It was not noble in the simple way some would later pretend. It was tangled in greed, frontier violence, land hunger, and blood. Native communities suffered terribly within its chaos. But to the wealthy ruling class, one lesson mattered more than anything else. The people they expected to remain beneath them were no longer fully staying in place. That truth hit Virginia harder than any fire. Fode and the others in the quarters did not know every political detail, but they did not need to. They understood the mood. They understood that when powerful men begin arguing among themselves, the air changes for everyone below. They understood that when the masters stop sleeping easily, the plantation itself becomes less predictable. They understood that instability can create danger, but it can also create openings, however small. The plantation changed quickly. Patrols increased. Horses were kept ready. Men came and went at strange hours. The overseers became harsher, but not stronger. In fact, their cruelty now carried the nervousness of men who sensed they might not be as secure as they had always believed. Even the sermons changed. Ministers who once preached order now preached obedience with greater desperation, warning against rebellion as if rebellion were a disease carried by the wind. That was how power often revealed fear, by suddenly wrapping itself in religion and pretending its own survival was the will of God. Then the rebellion burst into the open. News came in fragments, then in floods. Armed men were moving. Estates were being threatened. Buildings had burned. The governor had fled. Panic spread faster than certainty. The wealthy, who had once treated Virginia like their private kingdom, now found themselves looking over their shoulders like hunted men. The roads carried tension. The nights carried rumor. Every rider might be carrying warning. Every stranger might be carrying trouble. For the enslaved, none of this meant freedom, but it did mean disruption, and disruption was dangerous to a system built on routine. The normal order of plantation life began to shake. Instructions changed. Priorities shifted. Masters who once focused entirely on labor now worried about their own survival. For the first time in a long while, the people in chains could see the people holding the chains afraid. One night, beneath a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the fields whole, Fode slipped toward the tree line where Abena waited in the stillness. The old man had become thinner with age, but his presence had only grown heavier, because time had turned him into something more than a laborer. He had become a keeper of truths, too dangerous for daylight. Fode stood beside him and asked the question, pressing against his chest. "If the rich and the poor begin tearing at each other," he said, "what does that mean for us?" Abena did not answer immediately. He listened to the wind moving through the trees, then said in a low, steady voice, "When the house of the thief begins to shake, do not celebrate too early. He may only rebuild the lock stronger." Fode felt the truth of it instantly. Disorder among the powerful did not guarantee justice for the enslaved. Sometimes it only taught the powerful how to tighten their grip, and that was exactly what Virginia was about to do. Bacon's rebellion was crushed, but what mattered most was not that it failed. What mattered most was what it taught the elite. They looked at what had nearly happened and drew the coldest lesson possible. They realized that too many people in the colony had reason to be angry. Poor whites were bitter. Servants were frustrated. The enslaved were enduring. And if these different groups ever began to see each other too clearly, if they ever understood how much of their suffering came from the same small class of men, then Virginia itself could become impossible to control. That possibility terrified the ruling class more than anything else. So they did not solve the suffering. They reorganized it. They sharpened it. They divided it more deliberately. And the tool they chose would become one of the deadliest inventions in American history, race as permanent hierarchy. The wealthy began offering poor whites something subtle but powerful, not wealth, not equality, not security, but status, a poisonous kind of status. They encouraged them to believe that no matter how poor, hungry, or disposable they might be, they still stood above black people in the eyes of the colony. That false elevation changed everything. It gave many poor whites a reason to look upward toward the planter class with loyalty rather than sideways toward fellow sufferers with understanding. It was a trap disguised as pride, and it worked with terrible efficiency. Fode saw the change first in the smallest moments. Men who had once cursed their conditions beside him now straightened their backs when speaking to him, as if someone had placed a crown of emptiness on their heads. A servant who once shared stale bread now called him boy when overseers were near. Another began volunteering for patrols. Another laughed too loudly when a black laborer was insulted, eager to prove where he stood. These were not isolated acts. They were signs that the colony was being rewired. The ruling class had found a way to make poor men defend a system that still crushed them, simply by convincing them that at least it crushed someone else harder. That was one of the most powerful and destructive tricks in the making of America. Abena saw the same transformation in the house. The mistress and her friends began speaking of Africans with a new confidence, as if the recent unrest had proven not the failures of the wealthy, but the need to define blackness itself as permanent inferiority. Their language hardened. Their assumptions hardened. Their children absorbed these lessons with frightening ease. White children learned command before compassion. Black children learned caution before play. The colony was no longer merely using slavery as labor. It was teaching itself how to believe in slavery as a natural order. And once a society begins teaching its children that domination is normal, cruelty gains a longer life than law alone could ever give it. Soon the legal changes followed the fear. The line between black and white, once unstable in the earliest years of Virginia, began to harden into policy. Punishments became more unequal. Rights became more restricted. The colony moved steadily away from uncertainty and toward design. Africans and their descendants were being forced into a new and more permanent category, not temporary laborers, not people whose status might still shift, but inheritable property, bodies meant to remain bound across generations. This was one of the darkest turns in the beginning of slavery in America because the system was no longer simply exploiting people in the present. It was now planning to own the future. It was beginning to imagine children not as human lives, but as future labor already waiting to be counted. Na understood that more deeply than anyone. She had once nearly collapsed under the weight of knowing that her child had been claimed by the plantation before learning to walk. But now grief had sharpened into vigilance. She watched over the younger ones with a fierce, quiet intensity, as if she could guard them with memory alone. Abena continued speaking to them in the evenings, passing on stories and lessons that sounded simple to the untrained ear, but carried truths the plantation could never afford to let survive. Fode taught the boys how to read danger in footsteps and voices. Abena whispered old Akan words into the ears of children in the kitchen when no one was listening. These were not grand acts. They were not dramatic rebellions. But they mattered, because while the colony was trying to build a racial order strong enough to outlive the people who invented it, the enslaved were trying just as hard to keep alive a memory older than America's lies. One night, as the quarters settled into uneasy silence and the insects hummed in the dark, Abena said something that stayed with the Fode long after the old man had fallen quiet. "Listen carefully to the laws," he told them. "They will tell you what the masters fear." Fode thought about that for many nights after, and the more the laws tightened, the more clearly he understood. Every rule, every patrol, every restriction, every punishment was a confession. A confession that the enslaved were still not broken enough to be trusted. A confession that memory still lived. A confession that freedom still existed somewhere in the imagination. A confession that the colony knew the people it called inferior were still fully human, still capable of thought, still capable of longing, still capable of resistance. That was the deepest truth hidden beneath all the changes after Bacon's rebellion. Slavery in America was not becoming stronger because it had been morally justified. It was becoming stronger because it was still unstable and needed constant reinforcement. The rich had nearly lost control once, and they were determined never to come that close again. So they built harder. They legislated faster. They divided more deliberately. They taught their children earlier. They tightened the cage. And as Virginia moved toward a harsher future, the colony was no longer merely experimenting with bondage. It was building the foundations of a racial system so deep that future generations would one day inherit it, as if it had always been there. But the people forced to live inside it knew otherwise. They had watched the cage being assembled piece by piece. They had seen the lie being shaped into law. And because they had seen it being made, they also knew something the masters feared more than open rebellion. Anything built by human hands can one day be exposed, remembered, and named for what it truly was. The first years after the Africans arrived in English America were filled with confusion so dangerous that it almost looked like hope. That is how cruel systems often grow, not by showing their final form at once, but by pretending that what is happening is temporary, negotiable, or uncertain until the trap is already closed. In Virginia and other early colonies, labor was everywhere, and mercy was nowhere. Tobacco was no longer a gamble. It was becoming a golden leaf, and every acre planted meant more wealth for the men who controlled the land. Those men did not see fields. They saw empires. They saw ships, houses, titles, and sons who would inherit comfort. But every dream of wealth rested on bent backs, split fingers, fevered lungs, and people who could be forced to work until their bodies collapsed into the same earth they had been ordered to cultivate. At first, colonial labor systems were mixed and unstable. English indentured servants, Irish laborers, poor wanderers, transported prisoners and Africans, all moved through the edges of this harsh world, though never with equal treatment. Some Africans eventually gained a measure of freedom in the early decades, acquired land, married, and built lives in the narrow spaces allowed to them. This fact is often forgotten, but it matters deeply. The first years after the Africans arrived in English America were filled with confusion, so dangerous that it almost looked like hope. That is how cruel systems often grow, not by showing their final form at once, but by pretending that what is happening is temporary, negotiable, or and other early colonies in English America were filled with confusion, so dangerous that it almost looked like hope. That is how cruel systems often grow, not by showing their final form at once, but by pretending that what is happening is temporary, negotiable, or uncertain until the trap is already closed. In Virginia and other early colonies, labor was everywhere, and mercy was nowhere. Tobacco was no longer a gamble. It was becoming a golden leaf, and every acre planted meant more wealth for the men who controlled the land. Those men did not see fields. They saw empires. They saw ships, houses, titles, and sons who would inherit comfort. But every dream of wealth rested on bent backs, split fingers, fevered lungs, and people who could be forced to work until their bodies collapsed into the same earth they had been ordered to cultivate. At first, colonial labor systems were mixed and unstable. English indentured servants, Irish laborers, poor wanderers, transported prisoners and Africans, all moved through the edges of this harsh world, though never with equal treatment. Some Africans eventually gained a measure of freedom in the early decades, acquired land, married, and built lives in the narrow spaces allowed to them. This fact is often forgotten, but it matters deeply, because it proves that the rigid racial slavery, later known to the world, was not inevitable from the first day. It had to be engineered. It had to be hardened. It had to be protected with law because it was too unnatural to survive on uncertainty alone. Fode saw this dangerous in-between period with his own eyes. He watched one African man, older and cautious, walk with a kind of dignity others whispered about. The man had completed years of labor and was said to have secured freedom. People spoke his name with careful respect. That sight was enough to stir something restless in the camp quarters. If one man had crossed the line from bondage to freedom, perhaps others could. But hope in a brutal colony was like a candle in dry grass. It could either guide or destroy. Planters noticed every sign of ambition among the people they worked. They noticed literacy, memory, negotiation, and friendship. They especially noticed solidarity. Fode had begun to understand bits of English by then, enough to catch fragments of arguments among the white servants. They cursed the planters, too. They cursed the hunger, the punishments, the cheating, the endless labor. Some of them were barely treated better than the Africans in the fields, and that frightened the elites more than they admitted. Shared suffering creates dangerous conversations. It creates the possibility that the exploited might one day identify the real source of their misery. The planters had no intention of allowing that, so slowly, carefully, And with chilling precision, colonial society began changing the meaning of blackness itself. Skin color became more than appearance. It became a sentence. The law began to move like a knife. Cases emerged that revealed where things were headed. One of the most infamous involved a man named John Punch in the 1640s, an African servant who ran away with two European servants. All three were captured, but their punishments were not equal. The Europeans received added years to their service. Punch was sentenced to servitude for life. That moment did not invent slavery, but it exposed the colonial mind turning in a clear direction. The same act, the same escape, different futures. The message was plain. Black labor would be made permanent. Fode did not know the legal language of that case, but he felt its consequences ripple through the colony like poison in water. People began disappearing into longer and longer terms of labor. Overseers grew bolder. The field discipline became more savage. The white servants grumbled, but some of them also began to notice that no matter how poor they were, after Bacon's rebellion had been crushed and the smoke of panic settled over Virginia, the powerful men of the colony did not breathe easier, they became colder. The fear that had entered their hearts did not leave when the fighting ended. Instead, it changed shape. It turned into policy, into law, into strategy, and into a more dangerous kind of control than the colony had ever seen before. The elite had stared into a terrible possibility and did not like what they saw. They had seen how unstable their world truly was. They had seen how quickly anger could spread among the poor, the landless, the cheated, and the forgotten. They had seen how fragile their wealth looked when the people beneath them stopped suffering in silence. And from that moment, they made a choice that would shape the future of America for centuries. They would never again allow the lower classes to remain close enough in suffering to recognize each other as allies. If pain had the power to unite, then the rulers would make sure identity would divide. This was the moment when slavery in America stopped being a rough colonial labor system and began becoming something much more organized, much more deliberate, and much more terrifying. It was no longer enough for the elite to simply own labor. They now wanted to own the future itself. Fode felt the change before he could explain it. There was something sharper in the air after the rebellion, something more deliberate in the way the colony moved. The old disorder had not vanished, but it had been discipline. The planters no longer ruled only with greed. They ruled with lessons learned. They had watched chaos nearly swallow them, and now they were determined to build a system so tightly controlled that the next generation would not even remember a time before its rules. That is how oppression survives best, not only by violence, but by becoming familiar. The colony began tightening its legal grip with a speed that felt almost desperate. Laws multiplied, boundaries hardened. Distinctions that had once been unstable now became central to colonial order. Blackness, which in the earliest years had existed inside a shifting and uncertain labor world, was now being fixed more aggressively into a permanent category of subjugation. Whiteness, even for the poor, was being elevated into a social shield. The rich had found their answer. They would not solve inequality. They would organize it. They would make sure the hungry man saw skin before he saw chains. They would make sure the poor white servant dreamed of standing above the black laborer instead of asking why both were being crushed. That was one of the most effective and poisonous inventions in American history. It did not enrich most white people, but it gave many of them something they could mistake for dignity, racial status. And status, when handed to the desperate, can be enough to keep injustice standing for generations. Abena saw this new order forming inside the house with chilling clarity. The mistress had become more confident in her cruelty, as if the colony itself had finally given her permission to say aloud what she had long believed in private. She no longer spoke of Africans as laborers who happened to be trapped in misfortune. She spoke of them as if bondage belonged to them by nature. That change in language mattered. It was not just prejudice. It was ideology. It was the transformation of greed into belief. And once people begin believing that exploitation is natural, they stop seeing it as exploitation at all. They begin calling theft order. They begin calling domination civilization. They begin calling the suffering of others necessary. America was learning to do all three. The children of the household revealed it most clearly. The white children were being trained in ownership before they could even understand what ownership meant. They were taught who to command, who to ignore, who to fear, and who to treat as beneath them. The black children, meanwhile, learned the opposite lessons just as early. They learned caution before play, silence before curiosity, alertness before trust. They learned that a room could change the moment the wrong person entered it. They learned that one careless word could bring punishment not only on themselves, but on others. This was how slavery reproduced itself most effectively, not only through law or force, but through childhood. America was not just building plantations, it was building instincts. Fode saw the same pattern in the fields. Men who had once worked beside him and shared exhaustion now carried themselves differently. Some poor whites had begun acting as if the small privileges of race made them partners in power, even though they still had little land, little money, and little real control over their own lives. It was a bargain built on illusion, and yet it worked. That is the frightening power of social engineering. A man can be denied justice and still defend the system, denying it if he is convinced that someone else deserves even less. The colony had discovered that hierarchy could be sold downward, and once sold, it could be defended by those it did not truly benefit. This is why the beginning of slavery in America cannot be understood only as economics. It was also psychology. It was the construction of a mental world in which domination felt reasonable, difference felt permanent, and cruelty felt ordinary. And that mental world was becoming stronger every year. One of the most devastating legal changes had already begun to reshape everything. The rule that a child inherited the condition of the mother. That law had transformed enslaved women into unwilling engines of inherited labor. But now, in the years after the rebellion, its consequences became even more visible. Children born in the quarters were no longer simply children. In the eyes of the estate, they were future labor, future wealth, future bodies to be counted, disciplined and controlled. A child's first cry could already be heard by the master as prophet. That truth was so monstrous that many could not speak it aloud, but everyone living inside the system felt its weight. Na, who had once nearly broken under the knowledge that her child had been claimed by the plantation before learning to walk, had become something almost mythic in the quarters. She spoke little, but when she did, even the older ones listened. She had turned her grief into vigilance. She watched over the children like a storm cloud over dry earth, always aware that America's next theft would come disguised as routine. One evening, after hearing the master casually discuss the value of several growing boys as if he were speaking about livestock, she returned to the quarters with such silence in her face that even the children stopped playing when they saw her. That night she told them stories from the Akan world, stories of cleverness, memory, and hidden strength. She did not tell them because she believed stories alone could save them. She told them because if the system was determined to make them forget they came from human people, then remembering became a form of resistance. Abena understood that deeply. Though age had bent his back and slowed his steps, his mind remained sharp, and in the darkness after labor he became something more than a man. He became a keeper of fragments. He remembered songs, names, customs, warnings, and ways of seeing the world that the plantation could not entirely erase. The young gathered near him not because they were free to dream, but because memory itself had become one of the few places where freedom still survived. "They want your body first," he told them one night, his voice low but steady. "Then your labor, then your children, then your memory. If they take the last one, the rest will seem normal." That sentence stayed with Fode longer than any sermon he had ever overheard in the house. It explained the deeper project of American slavery more clearly than any law ever could. This was not only a system that wanted work, it was a system that wanted normalization. It wanted generations to grow up believing that what had been constructed through greed and violence had always been the natural order of the world. That is how slavery truly began to root itself in America, not simply through capture and transport, but through repetition, law, profit, fear, and the training of the imagination. Yet even as the colony grew more confident, it remained haunted. That haunting never left. It showed itself in the patrols, in the curfews, in the sudden inspections, in the punishment for gathering, in the fear of drums, in the suspicion of prayer, in the anxiety surrounding literacy, and in the constant obsession with movement. The enslavers behaved like men who believed they had complete control, but their actions revealed something else. They were terrified. They were terrified because the people they claimed were naturally submissive kept proving otherwise. They were terrified because memory kept surviving. They were terrified because families still formed, because songs still carried meaning, because children still asked questions, because the enslaved still looked at the horizon as if it might one day answer them back. One night, long after the main house had gone dark, and the wind had begun moving through the trees like a warning, Fode sat outside the quarters beside a boy who had never seen Africa and barely understood what the older ones meant when they spoke of before. The boy looked at him and asked, "Were we always like this here?" It was such a small question, but it carried the whole weight of America inside it. Fode stared into the dark for a long time before answering. He thought of the coast. He thought of the ship. He thought of Abena's silence when they were first brought to land. He thought of the laws, the fields, the children, the lies. And then he said quietly, "No, this was made." The boy frowned, not fully understanding. Fode continued, "Men built this. They wanted more than they could earn with honest hands. So they built this, and then they taught their sons to call it normal. That was the truth. But the deeper the colony sank into slavery, the more it became trapped by the very evil it had created. Because once a society learns to profit from stolen freedom, it can never fully rest. And Virginia was no longer a place at peace with itself. It was a place pretending to be stable while quietly rotting from within. The plantations looked stronger from a distance, the tobacco fields wider, the houses larger, the roads busier, and the masters more polished in their speech. But beneath all of that was a world held together by tension, fear, and constant performance. The men who ruled the colony wanted everyone to believe that order had finally arrived, that the old uncertainty was gone, that the laws had solved the problem, that black people had been permanently placed where they belonged, and that poor whites had found their proper place above them. But no matter how many laws they passed, no matter how many sermons they preached, and no matter how many patrols they sent into the night, they could not silence the truth that kept haunting them. The system was still unnatural, and anything unnatural must always be guarded. Fode understood that better with age. He had once thought the worst thing a man could experience was being torn from his homeland and forced across the sea, but now he knew there was another kind of horror that lasted even longer. The horror of watching a lie become normal around you. The horror of seeing children born into chains while those in power called it law. The horror of hearing men speak calmly about buying and selling human life as if they were discussing cattle, tools, or sacks of grain. The pain of slavery was not only in the labor, it was in the atmosphere. It was in the way people had to think, move, breathe, and survive inside a world that denied their full humanity every hour of every day. Abena had long since learned that the plantation had two faces, one for daylight and one for darkness. In daylight, it pretended to be a place of work and routine, of schedules, chores, crops, and order. But in darkness, its true shape appeared. At night, secrets moved. Fear breathed louder. Whispers became plans. Footsteps mattered. Every creak of wood, every distant bark of a dog, every lantern moving where no lantern should be, could mean danger or opportunity or both. It was at night that memory became strongest, because the night belonged less to the masters than the day did. In the shadows, stories survived. Warnings were passed. Names were remembered. Fragments of Africa, half broken but not dead, still moved from one generation to another. The younger children would sometimes sit close to Abena, whose voice had become softer with age but no less powerful, and listen as he spoke of places they had never seen, rivers with names America did not know, markets alive with color and trade, drums that carried messages farther than horses, and elders whose wisdom was not measured by property but by what they could preserve. To the children, these stories sounded almost like myths. To Abena, they were a duty. He knew that if memory died, the plantation would have won something worse than labor. It would have won the right to define reality, and that, more than any whip or chain, was what the old man feared most. One evening, after a long day of punishing heat and quiet tension in the fields, a rider arrived at the main house with news from another estate farther south. There had been an attempted escape. Several men and one woman had vanished in the night, carrying stolen food, a small knife, and enough courage to terrify an entire district. The alarm spread immediately. Masters met in urgent voices. Overseers doubled their rounds. Dogs were prepared. White laborers were warned to remain alert. And that is how slavery began in America. Not by accident, not by fate, and not because it was right, but because powerful men chose profit over human life and built a system of pain that would shape generations. What started with ships, chains, fear, and greed slowly became one of the darkest foundations of American history. But even in that darkness, one truth never died. The people who were enslaved never stopped being human, never stopped resisting, never stopped remembering, and never stopped carrying the strength of those who came before them. Their pain was real, their courage was real, and their story deserves to be told with truth, with honor, and with no lies added to it.